Hamilton makes an argument. He says this is in many ways the most horrific aspect of slavery. That's that trade across the Atlantic. We're decent people. We're Americans. We ought not be doing this. We should get rid of it today. We should end it right now. So there are the two demands. Let the slave trade go on forever versus get rid of it now, instantly. They have a big fight. Threats of secession are thrown out, and they reach a compromise. 20 years. 20 years. It will be allowed to go on for 20 years, and in 20 years, Congress may prohibit it if they want. On January 1, 1808, the President of the United States is none other than Thomas Jefferson. And he signs into law a bill forever prohibiting the Atlantic slave trade. They ended the slave trade literally on the first day allowed under the Constitution, 20 years to the day. When you consider that this institution has been around for thousands of years, when the modern Atlantic trade had already been in existence for almost 200 years, and the demands are let it go on forever versus let's end it now, and the great result is 20 years, and keep the Union together, pretty good. Pretty good. The last clause in Article 4, Section 2 is the Fugitive Slave Clause. Again, it's demands by the South. They see the writing on the wall. Beginning with Massachusetts, several states had already abolished slavery by the time of the Constitutional Convention. Well, what are you going to do if you have a slave state bordering a free state? And what if a slave runs away, crosses the state line into the free state? Does he become a free man or free woman? Does he become a citizen? What happens to him? They insist that there be a clause in the Constitution that offers protection to recover runaway slaves. They again back it up with threats of secession. The North again makes a compromise, and you get the Fugitive Slave Clause in Article 4, Section 2. At the same time that the convention is trying to hammer out this new Constitution, Congress, under the old Articles of Confederation, which is still the Constitution in America, there's one piece of land. Imagine I'm the map of the United States, right? And here's the West Coast out here. Here's the East Coast. And you think of America as this big thing spanning coast to coast. But at the time of the founding, America was basically a handful of people smashed along the eastern seaboard. This is America over here. So from this point of view, if you go to the north and the west, you end up with this chunk of land that eventually will become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin. That is the Northwest Territory. It's a piece of land owned in common by the Americans, by the United States. And Congress passes a law, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is one of the first acts of the new Congress under the Constitution in 1789. They repassed that same law, prohibiting the spread of slavery into the territory. So if you're an American, if you live in South Carolina and you want to migrate out into the territory and set up a farm or build a house or start a business, you're free to do that, but don't take your slaves. Slavery is prohibited by law. At the same time, from 1776, the Declaration of Independence, to 1800, that's only 24 years. In those 24 years, 7 of the original 13 states abolished slavery. They either abolish it immediately or they pass laws for the gradual elimination of it. Typically, people born into slavery would become free once they turned 21 or 25. So the idea was within a generation, there will be no slaves. More than half of the original states. When I look at this, it seems to me very clear that what the founding generation did, first they find themselves with this evil that they did not create. This was a British institution, protected by, regulated by British law. They inherited. Upon declaring independence, they treat slavery like a cancer. They keep it confined to the states where it exists. They stop its supply. They stop it from spreading. And they work within those states, state by state, to get rid of it. And they do a pretty good job. Eventually, it will take a massive, bloody civil war to finish that job. 7 years later. But when you look at this, I say, anyone, let me put it this way, anyone who asks, well, why didn't Americans do more to get rid of slavery? My response is, you're asking the wrong question. You're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why did they do anything at all? They had no obligation to do anything. I can't even get my mind around the way some people look at and think about this problem. They act as if slavery is this outdated, anachronistic thing from the past. Do you people know that slavery exists today? Do you know this? Do you know that we can go out, we can get on an airplane this afternoon at DIA, and in 2 or 3 connections, we can land in the Sudan in North Africa tomorrow, and if you have enough cash, you can buy a human being. So when people say to me, well, the Americans didn't do enough, they should have done more, my response is, what should their model have been? The Africans? Should Americans have acted the way Africans haven't figured out how to get rid of slavery to this day? Should they have followed the example of the Greeks, the Romans? Nobody else had done this. There was no model. What they did is they looked at that principle and they struggled mightily, often opposed to their own self-interest. Because the bottom line is a lot of people were making a lot of money on it. So how do you tell people, well, just ignore your financial self-interest and go do the right thing? That would be easy if they were angels. Governing a nation of angels is a really simple thing. But we never govern a nation of angels. We govern a nation of human beings who have real interests. And yet the Americans, in the end, choose what is right over and above their interest. And I say, God bless them and congratulate them for that. And thus I follow the lead of both Abraham Lincoln and one of his best friends when he was in office, Frederick Douglass, former slave turned abolitionist. Those two developed this beautiful friendship when Lincoln was president. And both of them make the argument that those compromises in the Constitution were absolutely the right thing to do at that time in that situation. That had the delegates of the convention reached for any more justice, they would have failed miserably. You would have seen the formation, the Union would have split apart, and there would have been the formation of a Southern slaveocracy. And that wouldn't be in the interest of any slave. And therefore, they did precisely what they needed to do at the moment they needed to do it. Frederick Douglass calls the Constitution a glorious liberty document. It was designed for a free people. When you look at the structure of the Constitution, slavery is 100% a creature of state law. It is regulated entirely state by state. As states get rid of it, not one word of the Constitution has to be changed. There are clauses in there that refer to free persons and unfree persons. Well, if the states can get rid of it, eventually there'll be 0 unfree persons, and those sections of the Constitution are just null. They don't mean anything. I'm going to wrap up there and open up to any questions anyone has. Thank you very much. Please.
You said Georgia was a major slave trader, right? When did Governor Oglethorpe come into play? Because he was against, Oglethorpe was against slavery, said no man should be owned by anyone else.
Yeah. What is your question for me?
Pardon?
What is your question for me?
Well, when was Oglethorpe in all this? Was he much later or after the Constitution?
Well, he's a contemporary, but the point is there are massive fights. What the Americans come to see is that they recognize nobody offered a justification of slavery. Everybody denounced it. The most you got from anyone in the founding period was this kind of sort of red-faced, embarrassed acknowledgement that we're making money on it. It's not right, it's not good, but we're making money on it. And in a way, here's the rub, here's the great challenge of self-government. If, in fact, all men are created equal, we have the same rights, and therefore, the only legitimate government is government by consent of the governed, Right? If you and I are equal in our rights, our God-given rights, you have no authority to rule over me, I have no authority to rule over you. If either of us is going to do any ruling over the other, it has to be with the other's permission or consent. How do you combine consent, though, with justice? What do you do when people won't give their consent to full and complete justice? That's the great challenge of merging these things together. Justice is easy if you're some grand universal tyrant and your will is the law. You can just impose justice.
Yes.
But if you're operating with the consent of the governed and they say, no, we're not going to get rid of slavery right now, we're making too much money on it, that becomes a massive problem.
Yeah, because the Georgians still imported slaves, even though there was no slavery allowed in Georgia for a time. They took them from South Carolina.
Well, you have a small black market of importation from Africa. Interestingly, by the way, even the Southerners agreed in that law prohibiting the Atlantic slave trade. It's a capital offense. And the first president to hang a man for violating that is President Abraham Lincoln. Lets a man be hung for bringing in the ship of slaves. But and let me put this in a little broader context. When the founders talked about slavery, they always talked about emancipation, freeing slaves, coupled together with colonization. Send them away. Let them set up their own regime somewhere. And there were all kinds of ideas floated around. Maybe the government can buy an island in the Caribbean, maybe a spot of land in South America or back in Africa, somewhere. And many critics simply chalk this up to their bigotry, that they didn't like black people. They didn't want to live around them. This isn't true. If you look on your handouts real quickly on page 3. The second to the last quote. This is Jefferson in his notes on the state of Virginia, imagining as a kind of hypothetical. Imagine we could just get rid of slavery instantly. Imagine we could wave a wand and tomorrow morning every black man, woman, and child who was a slave today will wake up as a free person. What would that look like? And here is his reflection. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites. 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained. New provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race.